The dust did not care. It rose in fine, pale sheets with every shuffle of a boot, every nervous cough from the crowd that had gathered in the merciless sun. It settled on the raw post in the center of the miserable little town, and it settled on her. It coated the frayed edges of her dress, a garment the color of dishwater, and it clung to the sweat on her skin, turning it to a gritty paste. Her hands were bound behind the rough-hewn wood, the rope already having rubbed the skin from her wrists to a weeping red. She did not look at the faces. She looked past them to the place where the heat made the distant mesas tremble as if the land itself was unsteady. She had been there since sunup, left by a man whose promises had turned to dust faster than the road behind his wagon. He had called her his ward, then his debt, and now simply his problem left for the town to solve. The murmuring had started as a low hum, like flies buzzing over something spoiled. It rose and fell with the passing of each man who looked her over, a piece of unwanted livestock. Their eyes were hard, calculating, or worse, indifferent. She was a stray thing, a complication in a place that had no room for them. Her hair, the color of dry straw, had come loose from its braid and fell in greasy strands across her face. She did not move to brush it away. Movement was a currency she could not afford to spend. Every twitch, every flinch was an invitation for more scrutiny, more speculation. So she remained still, a statue carved from exhaustion and shame, her bare feet planted in the hot, shifting dirt. The sun beat down on her head, a physical weight pressing her further into the earth. Silence was her only shield, a thin, brittle thing against the sharp edges of their judgment. She had made herself small inside, a kernel of a person tucked away in a deep, dark place where the heat and the voices could not quite reach. From the shade of the general store's overhang, Silas watched. He had come into town for salt and flour, a trip he made only when the emptiness of his own larder became more oppressive than the emptiness of the town. He was a man made of quiet angles and worn denim, his face a map of sun and sorrow etched by a loss that had hollowed him out years ago. He carried whole winters in his eyes. He saw the woman at the post. He saw the way the wind lifted a strand of her hair and laid it back down, gently, a kindness the people watching her did not possess. He saw the tight line of her jaw, the only sign of the war she was waging within herself. He'd seen that look before on a cornered coyote just before it was shot. It was the look of something that had given up on rescue but not yet on breathing. The storekeeper, a man named Cobb with a soft belly and softer principles, wiped the counter with a damp rag. Shame, ain't it? Fella who brought her, one of Barlow's men, said she was part of a land deal that went sour. Just left her. Said Barlow could come fetch his property if he wanted. Silas said nothing. He placed his coins on the counter for the flour and salt. The clink was unnaturally loud in the quiet store. Property? The word landed wrong in the still air. It was a word for a mule or a parcel of land. Not for the sliver of a woman with wrists rubbed raw and a gaze fixed on the horizon. He turned and walked back out into the glare. The crowd was beginning to thin, their curiosity sated, their meager pity exhausted. They had lives to get back to, suppers to cook, fences to mend. The woman was just a feature of the landscape now, a temporary landmark of misfortune. Silas stood there for a long time, the weight of the flour sack in one hand a familiar comfort. He looked at her, then at the faces of the men who remained, the ones whose stares were a little too long, a little too speculative. He thought of his own quiet cabin, of the second empty chair at his table, of the grave on the hill overlooking the creek. His life was a vessel of absence, a carefully maintained emptiness. To bring something into it felt like a betrayal. To do nothing felt like a sin. The man who had tied her there, the one they said worked for Barlow, had apparently settled his own bar tab with the promise of her. The saloon owner, a man with a face like a clenched fist, was complaining about it to the blacksmith. Silas walked toward them. His steps were slow, deliberate, kicking up little puffs of dust that lifted behind him like ghosts. He stopped before the saloon owner. He did not look at the woman, but he felt her presence behind him. A small, still point in the turning world. What was his debt? Silas's voice was low, rusty from disuse, like it came from under floorboards. The saloon owner eyed him, surprised. What's it to you, Blackwood? I'll settle it. A dry chuckle. With what? You barely got enough to keep that dirt patch of yours from blowing away. Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out the worn leather pouch where he kept the money he'd been saving for winter seed. It was not much, but it was everything. He untied the drawstring and poured a small cascade of coins into his palm. He held it out. It was more than a bar tab. It was a statement. The saloon owner's eyes widened, just a fraction. He looked from the coins to Silas's face, a face that offered no explanation, no compromise. He saw the hard set of his jaw, the unyielding calm in his eyes. He grunted, scooped the coins from Silas's hand, and turned away without another word. The transaction was done. An unspoken purchase. A life weighed in silver. Silas turned and walked to the post. He did not speak to her. He did not meet her eyes. He simply pulled a small, sharp knife from his belt, the one he used for whittling sticks on long, quiet evenings. He reached behind her, his movements careful, and sawed at the thick rope. The fibers groaned and then snapped. Her hands fell to her sides, limp. She did not move. She seemed to be waiting for the next set of instructions, the next binding. "Come on," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. He gestured with his head toward his wagon, hitched a few yards away. She took a hesitant step, then another. Her legs were stiff, her feet tender on the hot ground. She followed him, a shadow trailing a ghost, leaving the post and the town behind her. She did not look back. The journey was a long stretch of silence broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the sigh of the wind across the plains. The sun beat down, relentless. Silas sat on the driver's bench, his back straight, his gaze fixed on the two thin lines of the track that disappeared into the vast, empty canvas of the land. She sat in the back, huddled against the flour sack, making herself as small as possible. The world she knew had been burned away and she was adrift in the ashes. He stopped the wagon once when the sun was at its highest, a searing white coin in a bleached sky. He climbed down without a word and unhooked a canteen from the side of the wagon. He walked to the back and held it out to her. She stared at it, then at his hand. It was a large hand, calloused and crisscrossed with scars from work and weather. It did not tremble. It simply offered. She reached for the canteen, her own fingers thin and pale against the dark tin. Her knuckles were scraped, her nails broken. She drank, the water cool and tasting of metal and mercy. It was the first act of simple kindness she had known in so long it felt like a dream. When she was done, she handed it back, her eyes briefly meeting his before skittering away. In his gaze, she saw not pity but a deep, quiet weariness that seemed to match her own. They arrived as dusk was bleeding purple and orange across the horizon. The cabin was small, built of weathered logs the color of old bones, chinked with mud that had cracked and dried over countless seasons. It stood alone in a shallow valley, a single flickering light in a world of growing shadow. A modest barn leaned nearby, and a small, fenced-in garden showed signs of a stubborn battle against the dry earth. On a small hill that overlooked the creek, a single wooden cross stood stark against the sky. The place was a reflection of the man, solitary, stark, and haunted by a presence that was no longer there. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. He helped her down from the wagon, his hand hovering near her elbow but never touching. He led her inside. The interior was one room, clean but spare. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a rough-hewn table with two chairs sat in the center, and a bed was tucked into a corner. A curtained-off alcove suggested another sleeping space. The air smelled of wood smoke, old wool, and something else, a faint, lingering scent of lavender and loss. He gestured toward the table. "Sit." She sat, her hands folded in her lap. She watched as he moved around the small space with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. He lit a second lamp, chasing the deeper shadows into the corners. He stirred the embers in the hearth and added a few pieces of wood, coaxing a flame to life. The fire crackled, a small, brave sound in the heavy silence. He cut thick slices from a loaf of dark bread and set them on a wooden plate. He ladled stew from a pot that had been simmering by the fire into two bowls. He placed one bowl in front of her, along with a spoon. He sat opposite her and began to eat without a word. The stew was thick with potatoes and a little meat, hot and savory. It was the first real food she had eaten in days. Each spoonful was a small miracle, warming her from the inside out. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against earthenware and the crackle of the fire. The shared meal was a treaty, a quiet negotiation in a language older than words. When they were finished, he took the bowls to a wash basin. He did not ask her to help. He did not ask her anything. He gestured to the curtained alcove. "You can sleep there. The bed is made." He paused, his back to her. "I don't lock my door." The words hung in the air. It was not a command, but a promise. A promise of freedom, of trust. It was so unexpected it made her heart ache. She went behind the curtain without a word. The bed was narrow, but the blankets were clean and smelled of sun and wind. It was more than she could have hoped for. She lay down, fully clothed, and listened to the sounds of him moving about the cabin before settling into his own bed. She heard the soft sigh of the mattress, the rustle of a blanket. And then only the sound of the fire and the wind, a low moan around the corners of the little house. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she felt the possibility of safety, fragile as a spider's web, but there. Days bled into one another, measured not by a calendar but by the rising and setting of the sun. A routine formed, unspoken, an architecture of shared tasks built on a foundation of silence. He would rise before dawn, his movements quiet so as not to wake her. She would lie still, listening to the scrape of his boots on the floorboards, the splash of water as he washed his face, the clink of the stove as he made coffee. When he went out to tend to the few chickens and the one milk cow, she would rise. The first morning she had simply sat at the table, a ghost in his house. The second she swept the floor, the rhythmic scrape of the broom a comfort. He had come back in, stopped in the doorway and simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of acknowledgement. She learned the geography of his grief. The way he would sometimes stop his work and stare at the grave on the hill, his shoulders slumping just a little. The way he never used the rocking chair by the fire, the one with a faded quilt draped over its back. It was her chair, his wife's. Sarah. He had said the name once, under his breath, when a gust of wind had slammed the cabin door shut, and for a moment he had looked up as if expecting to see her. She began to mend his shirts, her stitches small and neat. She found a stash of thread in a wooden box alongside needles and a silver thimble worn smooth with use. She imagined the hands that had last used them, and a pang of something kinship, trespass, went through her. He never commented on the mended cuffs or the patched elbows, but he left a bowl of wild berries he'd picked by her plate the next morning. One afternoon, while he was out checking fence lines, she walked up the small hill to the grave. The wooden cross was simple, with one word carved into it, Sarah. The earth was settled, covered in dry grass. A few stubborn wildflowers grew at the base. She picked one, a tiny purple blossom no bigger than her thumbnail, and laid it on the packed dirt. It seemed a small, inadequate thing, but it was all she had to offer. When he returned, he did not mention it, but that evening by the fire, he seemed to look at her differently, his gaze less guarded, as if seeing her for the first time not as a stray he had taken in, but as a person who understood sorrow. The cold began to set in, a deep, biting cold that seeped through the cracks in the logs. One morning, she awoke shivering. When she emerged from her alcove, a heavy wool shawl was draped over her chair. It was dark gray, soft and warm. It smelled of him, of wood smoke and pine. She wrapped it around her shoulders, and the warmth felt like a shield. She wore it all day. He started leaving a second pail of water for her in the mornings so she would not have to go to the creek in the biting cold. She started baking bread using the flour he had bought that first day. Her first few loaves were dense and hard. He ate every slice without complaint. That loaf died in vain, she said one evening, her voice thin from disuse. It was the first full sentence she had offered. He looked up from his plate, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He chewed a piece of the dense bread thoughtfully. It's a little dry, he allowed. You didn't complain about mine, a voice from the past seemed to echo in the room. He blinked. Yours was better, he said, speaking to the memory as much as to her. A small, sad smile touched his lips and was gone. He looked at her again. But this is good. It's warm. That night, the past came for her. Not the man who had left her, but the fear he had planted in her. She dreamt of being tied to the post, but this time the sun was a black hole and the faces in the crowd had no eyes. A sound escaped her throat, a choked, desperate thing. She awoke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright, the blankets tangled around her legs. The cabin was dark, save for the faint orange glow of the embers in the hearth. The curtain to her alcove was pulled back. He was standing there, a tall silhouette against the dying firelight. He wasn't in her space, just at the edge of it. He held an old, single-shot rifle in one hand, held loosely at his side. He wasn't threatening her with it, he was guarding her with it. He just stood there, a silent sentinel, until her breathing slowed and the trembling in her hands subsided. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The gesture spoke volumes. It said, "You are safe here. I will not let the dark get you." After a long, still moment, he nodded once and retreated to his own bed. She lay back down, the image of him standing there burned into her mind. She pulled the wool shawl tighter around her, the one that smelled of him, and closed her eyes. The next day, as they worked in the garden, pulling the last of the hardy vegetables before the ground froze solid, she broke the comfortable silence. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She did not look at him. focusing on a stubborn root she was trying to dislodge. He stopped his work, leaning on his shovel. He knew what she was asking. Why her? Why the coins? Why the shelter? He looked out toward the mesas, the same direction she had stared that first day. My wife, Sarah, he said, the name a stone in his throat. She was the kindest person I ever knew. She would not have ridden past. He looked down at his hands on the shovel handle. Doing nothing felt like burying her all over again. It was the most he had ever said about his past, about his heart. It was a confession and a eulogy all at once. She finally managed to pull the root free from the cold earth. She looked at him, at this man who carried his grief like a second skin, who stitched his life together with raw thread. You're either the kindest man I've met, she said softly, or the most foolish. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Can't I be both? The first snow came a week later, a fine, white powder that dusted the world in silence. The peace of it, however, was short-lived. It was Silas who saw them first, 2 days after the snowfall. 3 riders, dark shapes moving slowly against the stark white of the distant plains. He had known, on some level, that this day might come. You could not erase a debt simply by paying it, sometimes you only transferred it. She came to stand beside him, wrapping the gray shawl tighter around herself. She saw the riders too. The stillness that came over her was absolute. It was not the frozen stillness of fear, but the sharp, hard stillness of a hawk that has spotted a snake in the grass. She had been reborn in this quiet valley, but the ghost of her old life had a long shadow. Go inside, he said, his voice low and steady. No, she replied. The word was not defiant, but firm. A simple statement of fact. She would not hide. Not anymore. He gave her a long look, then nodded. He went back inside and emerged a moment later. He did not check if it was loaded. He knew it was. The riders came closer, their horses kicking up sprays of snow. The man in the lead was stout, with a florid face and a fine coat that looked out of place in this rugged landscape. It was Barlow. He was flanked by 2 hard-faced men who looked like they were paid to be mean. They stopped a dozen yards from the cabin. Barlow's gaze swept over the small homestead with a sneer, as if the poverty of it offended him. Then his eyes landed on her, and a smug smile spread across his face. Well, well, he said, his voice carrying easily in the cold, still air. Look what the wind blew in. I've been looking for you, he spoke to her, but his eyes flickered to Silas, dismissing him as little more than a fence post. My man said he left my property in that sad excuse for a town. I've come to collect. Silas stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of her. The rifle hung loosely in the crook of his arm, its muzzle pointed at the ground. It was not a direct threat, but its presence was a clear answer. She's not property, Silas said. His voice was calm, devoid of anger or fear. It was the voice of a man standing on his own land, defending his own home. And she's not going anywhere. Barlow laughed, a short, ugly sound. Is that so? I have a bill of sale, rancher. A contract. She was part of a payment for 100 acres of grazing land. The law is on my side. There ain't much law out here, Silas replied evenly. Just what a man is willing to stand for. And I'm standing right here. You'd die for this stray? Barlow scoffed, his face turning a shade darker. She's not worth the bullet. Before Silas could answer, she stepped out from behind him. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a fire he had never seen before. She looked directly at Barlow, and for the first time, she did not look away. My name, she said, her voice clear and sharp, cutting through the cold, is Lena. The simple declaration hung in the air, a stunning act of defiance. To name herself was to claim herself. She was not property, not a stray, she was Lena. Barlow seemed taken aback, his bluster faltering for a second. He recovered quickly. I don't care what you call yourself. You belong to me. He made a motion to dismount, his hand reaching for her. As he moved, Silas raised the rifle, not aiming it, but bringing it to a ready position. It was a subtle shift, but it stopped Barlow cold. At the same moment, Lena bent down, her movement fluid and fast, and her hand closed around a heavy piece of firewood from the pile stacked by the porch. She held it like a club, her knuckles white. They stood there, a united front. The grieving rancher and the woman he had sheltered. He with his quiet, unyielding strength, and she with her newfound, blazing courage. They were not 2 broken people anymore. They were a fortress, small but impenetrable. Barlow looked from Silas's cold eyes to Lena's defiant ones. He saw the rifle. He saw the makeshift club. But more than that, he saw something in their faces that his money could not buy and his threats could not break. He saw a bond forged in shared silence and quiet kindness. He saw that to take her, he would have to destroy them both, and suddenly the effort seemed too great, the cost too high. The wind picked up, swirling snow around their feet. He slowly lowered the rifle. She let the piece of firewood fall from her hand with a soft thud. He turned to her. The tension drained out of him, leaving him looking tired, older. "I was scared," he admitted, the words a raw whisper. "I know," she said, her own voice trembling slightly. "Me too." She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "Lena," he said, testing the name on his tongue. It fit her. It was a good, strong name. "It's a good name." She gave him a small, watery smile, the first real smile he had ever seen from her. It was like watching the sun break through after a long storm. In that moment, the hollow space inside him, the one that had been vacant for so long, felt a little less empty. That night, the fire in the hearth seemed to burn brighter. After their quiet meal, Lena did something she had never done before. She went to the wooden chest where he kept the few mementos of his wife, the worn thimble, a book of pressed flowers, a handful of letters tied with a faded ribbon. She opened it, her movements slow and respectful. Silas watched her, his heart tight in his chest. She did not touch Sarah's things. Instead, from the folds of her own worn dress, she pulled out a small, crudely carved wooden bird. It was grimy and chipped, a relic from a life she no longer wanted. She held it for a moment, then walked to the fire and, without ceremony, tossed it into the flames. They watched together as the wood blackened, curled, and was consumed, turning from a symbol of her past into a flicker of light and a puff of smoke. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. The next day, he took down the curtain that separated her alcove from the rest of the cabin. It was a small gesture, but it removed the last barrier between them. The small house was no longer two separate spaces of lonely people, it was one shared home. Weeks turned into months. The winter was hard, but they faced it together. They fell into a new rhythm, one of easy companionship. They talked more, their conversations no longer just functional, but filled with small observations about the weather, stories from his past, questions about the future. He told her about Sarah, about their dream of filling the valley with children. She told him about her love of weaving, a skill her mother had taught her long ago. One evening, he was fixing a broken chair leg, his brow furrowed in concentration. She was darning a sock, her needles clicking softly in the firelight. "Silas," she said. He looked up. "We should get married." It was not a proposal born of passion, but of practicality, of a deep, quiet rightness. It was the next logical step in the life they had built, the final stitch in the fabric they had woven together. He stopped his work. He looked at her, at the way the firelight caught the gold in her hair, at the steady calm in her eyes. He thought of the empty house he had returned to for years and how it no longer felt empty. It breathed again. She had not just taken shelter in his home, she had brought it back to life. She had given him back his own. He put down his tools and walked over to her. He knelt before her and took her hands in his. Her fingers were no longer thin and pale, but capable and strong, roughened by work, just like his. "Yes," he said. "Yes, Lena. We should." The world outside the cabin remained a harsh and unforgiving place. The wind still howled and the snow still fell. But inside, by the warmth of the fire, two broken souls had found in each other not just a refuge, but a home. They sat together on the small porch as the spring thaw began, watching the creek swell with melted snow, the promise of new life returning to the valley. The single grave on the hill was no longer a monument to what was lost, but a quiet reminder of the kindness that had started it all. He reached over and took her hand, their fingers lacing together, a silent, perfect fit. The sun warmed their faces, and for the first time in a long, long time, the future felt not like a vast emptiness to be endured, but a shared path waiting to be walked. This story, it ain't just about a man rescuing a woman. It's about how sometimes the deepest healing comes not from being saved, but from being given the space to save yourself. It's about the profound power of a name, the one given to you and the one you choose for yourself. To be seen, truly seen, not as an object of pity or a piece of property, but as a person with a story and a soul that is a rescue all its own. We all have a post we've been tied to in one way or another. A past that holds us captive, a shame that binds our wrists. We wait in the dust, hoping for a kindness that feels as distant as the trembling horizon. And this story, it whispers that such kindness still exists. It's in the canteen of cool water, the warm shawl on a cold morning, the steady presence that stands guard against our nightmares. It's in the quiet courage it takes to stand up and name yourself in the face of a world that wants to label you as something less. So here is your naming. You are not your past. You are not your pain. You are the quiet strength that endures, the resilience that mends, the courage that finally speaks. And if you are brave enough to offer that same quiet kindness to another wounded soul, you might not just give them shelter for a night. You might find you've been given back your own life, right when you thought it was over. You might just find that the fire only changes everything when something new and beautiful is waiting in the ash.